Hello students, today I'm going to lecture on chapter 15, Voidable Contracts, Consent and Capacity. Capacity is the legal ability to enter into a contract. Minors who are under the age of 18 and those with mental impairment usually lack capacity. Consent refers to whether a contracting party truly understood the terms of the contract and whether he or she made the agreement voluntarily. Problems with consent and capacity make a contract voidable, which means one party has the option to enforce or terminate the contract. A voidable contract, unlike a void contract, is a valid contract which may be either affirmed or rejected at the option of one of the parties. At most, one party to the contract is bound, and the unbound party may repudiate or reject the contract, at which time the contract becomes void. Let's talk about minors and entering into contracts. So, disaffirmance. A minor may generally disaffirm a contract, that is, he or she may notify the other party that he refuses to be bound by the agreement. Only the party lacking capacity may cancel the agreement. So if an adult enters into a contract with a minor, only the minor may cancel that agreement. The minor also has the option of filing a lawsuit to rescind the contract, that is to have the court formally cancel the contract. And there's an example of disaffirmance on page 368 of the text. Let's look at that. We're at the bottom, disaffirmance. It says a minor who wishes to escape from a contract generally may disaffirm it. That is, he may notify the other party he refuses to be bound by the agreement. There are several ways a minor may disaffirm a contract. He may simply tell the other party, orally or in writing, that he will not honor the deal. Or he may disaffirm the contract by refusing to perform his obligations under it. A minor may go farther. He can undo a contract that has already been completed by filing a suit to rescind the contract. That is, to have it formally canceled by the court. So here's an example. Kevin Green was 16 when he signed a contract with Star Chevrolet to buy a used Camaro. Because he was a minor, the deal was voidable. When the Camaro blew a gasket and Kevin informed Star Chevrolet that he wanted his money back, he was disaffirming the contract. He happened to do it because the car suddenly seemed like a poor buy, but he could have disaffirmed for any reason at all. Such as deciding that he no longer liked the Camaro. When Kevin disaffirms the contract, he was entitled to his money back. And that's an example on the page of 368. Anyway, minors and restitution. A minor who disaffirms a contract must return the consideration he has received to the extent that he is able. So he would need to return the Camaro in order to get his money back. And timing, let's talk about when a minor can disaffirm. Minors may disaffirm a contract before they reach the age of 18 or within a reasonable time after turning 18. And there are two examples of that on the bottom of page 369 in the text in chapter 15. A minor may disaffirm a contract anytime before she reaches 18. She may also disaffirm within a reasonable time after turning 18. Suppose that a 17-year-old, Brett, signs a contract to buy a $3,000 3D TV. The following week, he picks up the TV and pays for it in full. 4 months later, he turns 18, and 2 months after that, after a Super Bowl party, he disaffirms the contract. His disaffirmance is effective because the court ruled within a few months after turning 18, he can legally disaffirm that contract. And there are more examples, which you might want to look at because you'll likely be quizzed on or tested on that. Exceptions to that rule about minors disaffirming are for necessaries and misrepresentation of age. So, what is a necessary? A necessary is something essential to a minor's life and welfare, such as food, clothing, shelter, medical care. So, on a contract for necessities, a minor must pay the full value of the benefit received. They have to pay for the food, they have to pay for the medical care. They cannot disaffirm a contract for that. And an exception to the minor rule is also misrepresentation of age. In some states, they will not allow a minor to disaffirm a contract if he's lied about his age, and other states may allow a minor to receive only the value of the returned goods. We're talking about capacity and mentally impaired person. The definition: a person with a mental illness or defect who is unable to understand the nature and consequences of the transaction. So, page 370, the entire page is devoted to examples and the law on mentally impaired persons, and that generally creates only a voidable contract. Intoxication, on page 371 in chapter 15, when an intoxicated person makes a contract, it is voidable if the party was so intoxicated that he didn't understand the nature and consequences of the transaction. The contract can be voidable. It's not if they made a bad decision while they were drinking. It's only if they can prove they were so intoxicated they had no idea, they could not understand the nature and consequences of the contract or the contractual transaction. And also, a mentally infirm party who seeks to void a contract must make restitution. 4 types of claims can be brought for lack of valid consent: fraud, mistake, duress, and undue influence. And we'll talk about those. The reality of consent. To rescind a contract based on misrepresentation or fraud, a party must show 3 things. 1, there was a false statement of fact, and that has to be a true fact. So fraud is a misrepresentation of a material fact. So it has to be true fraud or misrepresentation, as opposed to puffery, which is exaggerated sales talk. Puffery is not a statement of fact. For example, if you go buy a used car and say, "Oh, this beauty purrs like a kitten," that is puffery. It's exaggerated sales talk, as opposed to misrepresentation of a material fact or fraud. So if you go to buy a used car and the person tells you that the engine is working perfectly well, or the engine has been replaced with a new one and the engine is not working, that is fraud or misrepresentation of a material fact. So to rescind a contract based on misrepresentation or fraud, a party must show: 1, there was a false statement of fact; 2, the statement was fraudulent or material; and 3, the injured person justifiably relied on that statement. So if you relied on the statement that the engine was working perfectly and it wasn't, then that affects consent. Plaintiff's remedy for misrepresentation or fraud: if the maker's statement is fraudulent, like the used car salesman, the injured party generally has a choice of rescinding the contract or suing for damages. And under the UCC sale of goods, UCC section 2721 permits a party to rescind a contract and then sue for damages whether misrepresentation was fraudulent or innocent. But non-UCC, the misrepresentation must be fraud. Innocent misrepresentation means the owner believes the statement to be true and has good reason for that belief. Fraudulent misrepresentation means the owner knows that the statement is false or that the speaker makes a reckless misrepresentation. And there's an example in the text on page 377 with respect to with respect to that in the exam strategy. Let's see, 377. Oh my goodness. That's the drawback of working outside, even though it's a beautiful day. All right, so on mid page 377, the exam strategy, Mako is selling his country house for $400,000. Guppy, an interested buyer, asks whether there's sufficient water from the property's well. Mako replies, "Are you kidding? Watch this." He turns on the tap and the water flows bountifully. Mako then shows Guppy the well, which is full. Guppy buys the property, but 2 weeks later the well runs dry. In fact, Mako knew the water supply was inadequate, and he had the well filled by a tanker truck while the property was being sold. A hydrologist tells Guppy it would cost $100,000 to dig a better well, with no guarantee of success. Guppy sues Mako. What remedy should Guppy seek, and who will win? Classic example of fraud. Oh, the well's fine. When he knew it wasn't, he just covered it up temporarily. The result is, when Mako responded to Guppy's question by demonstrating the apparent abundance of water, he made a false statement, misrepresentation of a material fact. This was fraud, not innocent representation. Because Mako knew the well was inadequate, that was a material fact. Guppy reasonably relied on the demonstration. Guppy will win. He can elect to rescind the contract, meaning return the property to Mako and get his money back, or choose damages, the cost of digging a proper well. Given the uncertain nature of the well digging, he would be wise to rescind the contract. Okay. Special problem. Silence. What about silence? Non-disclosure of a fact is misrepresentation only when disclosure is necessary to correct a previous assertion or to correct a basic mistaken assumption. A seller must report any known latent defects that the buyer is not expected to discover himself. And latent means hidden. So they must disclose hidden defects. They also must create a mistaken understanding about a writing, and when there's a relationship about trust, when one party naturally expects openness and honesty based on a close relationship, the other party must act accordingly. Okay? Mistake. We'll talk about unilateral mistake versus bilateral mistake. Unilateral is on one side. Bilateral is a mistake on both ends. So sometimes only one party enters into a contract based on a mistaken assumption, a situation called unilateral mistake. To rescind for unilateral mistake, a party must demonstrate that she entered into a contract of a basic factual error and either one of two things. Enforcing the contract would be unconscionable, or the non-mistaken party knew about the error. And that's in the text. There's an example on page 378. Mutual mistake is a mistake that occurs when both parties negotiate based on the same factual error. If the parties contract based on an important factual error, the contract is voidable by the injured party. And there's an example in the text on page 380, and that has to do with a mistake of fact as to what a gem, stone, or ring, the gem in the ring really was. So here on page 380, mutual mistake. It says a mutual mistake occurs when both contracting parties share the same mistake. If the contract is based on a fundamental factual error by both parties, the contract is voidable by either one. So here's an example. Farnsworth is selling Corbin a topaz, and Corbin thinks he's buying a topaz. In fact, they are both wrong. The stone turns out to be a diamond. Since the parties made a material error as to the subject of their contract, there was no valid assent, and either one can rescind because they both think it's something that it's not. What about duress? and economic duress. How does that play into contract voidability? If one party makes a threat, meaning holding a gun to the other person's head, that causes the victim to enter into a contract with no reasonable alternative. The contract is voidable. In analyzing a claim of economic duress, courts look at factors like acts that have no legitimate business purpose, greatly unequal bargaining power, an unnaturally large gain for one party, and financial distress for one party. And I think we talked about unconscionability in the last chapter. Undue influence. To prove there's been undue influence, one must demonstrate a relationship between the two parties, either of trust or domination, and improper persuasion by the stronger party. And there's an example in the text on page 383 where an heiress is improperly persuaded by somebody with more leverage over her. Both parties must have the capacity to make a deal, and both parties must give genuine consent in order to have a valid contract. So that sums up chapter 15. Please join me for my Zoom lecture or my Zoom meeting on Wednesday, and we'll do practice questions on that content. Thanks. Have a great day. Stay healthy.